going to go to DC for a bit.
Well, speaking of mistreatment,
Oh,
and I'm glad one thing that's been a crash course for people on the right has been the abuse of the military industrial complex, the abuse of the existence and abuse of power by a deep state within our own government, the abuse of power by the FBI and the NSA, the abuse of power by our justice system, and the abuse of power in the context of criminal defendants and inmates. Things that, quite frankly, they didn't. Too many of them didn't care about for too long. Our
well, I mean, it's
founders did. Our founding generation did. People who went through the Civil War did. Some people who went through World War One did. But too many people on the right were dismissive of inmate concerns, criminal defendant concerns, civil rights concerns. And now that they've been the victim of that state power, they're starting to wake up to it. And many people are shocked that somebody like Owen Shroyer could be stuck in solitary confinement.
It's for COVID, Robert. Now, well, Shroyer is going to work our way into that other lawsuit about inmate conditions, and not to say that I was guilty of not caring. I don't think I ever didn't care, but it's not something you really think about. And the tendency is to say, FAFO, F around, find out. You'll go to jail. You'll be a criminal. Why would you get to play tennis on a sunny afternoon in jail? But the difference between that and not having rotten teeth removed from your mouth, as we'll get to in the other lawsuit, is one thing. And then you see when you've been maliciously prosecuted or, abused by the system, hauled off for 60 days for speech. Somebody online was saying Shroyer wasn't jailed for speech. It was for being present at the Capitol. I read through the charges. It was, among other things, for chanting 1776, which now has a very nefarious meaning. Vivek might want to be careful. So Shroyer is being hauled off. He was not granted bond pending the appeal of his 60 days in jail for speech, among other things. There might, being on the Capitol, if you want to parse hairs. He went off, and Jack Posobiec, I want to say not the post-millennial, but Human Events, the reporting that he was in solitary. And I was like skeptical. I was like, how the hell does he go into solitary? Was it a punishment? Did he... COVID. Apparently it's the COVID policy. I don't know how long he has to be in solitary for, but confirmed solitary for 2-3 days. Who the hell knows? And now people are saying, yeah, this is outrageous. Robert, what types of prisons still have COVID isolation policies in effect? Or some people are saying that there's always solitary policies in effect when you get to jail.
Well, I mean, that's part of the problem. So, there's now decades of research that show we basically torture inmates in America. That there's no other conclusion. So I've brought a lot of lawsuits challenging people that are in custody. Now, most of them were in jail. In other words, they were not convicted of any crime. They were simply charged with a crime or something else. Or people that were institutionalized because of mental illness issues. And their treatment in many of these mental institutions, in many of these jails, and in many of these prisons is barbarous. And would be recognized as barbarous if anybody else in the rest of the world did it. And so, particularly if you can contrast it, say, Western Europe. Now, are there worse prisons and jails? Yes. But America's ranked toward the bottom half of the world, not toward the top 10. Even though we, unlike most other countries in the world, have an Eighth Amendment that prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. It's that Eighth Amendment that limits how the government can treat a person in their custody, whether in jail, whether in a mental institution, or whether in a prison. Now, sometimes what the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth Amendment may apply rather than the Eighth Amendment, as the circumstances may be. But once you're in the Bureau of Prisons, the Eighth Amendment applies indisputably and incontrovertibly. The Supreme Court has recognized that means you have a right to adequate food and adequate health care. To me, solitary confinement outside of extraordinary circumstances should never be allowed because it is a deprivation and denial of adequate health care, by definition. We now have massive amounts of data that isolation of the kind we do in solitary confinement, depriving people of social contact, depriving people of recreation, depriving people of interaction with other humans, depriving people of access to pretty much anything, often depriving them of access to the outside world, often having the light on 24 hours, often providing inadequate food, drives them insane, causes severe mental health problems. It doesn't help. It doesn't improve the quality of custodial control. And so that's where, outside of a circumstance where you have someone who is so uncontrollably violent that the only alternative to protect other inmates is their solitary confinement, should anyone be in solitary. And that's still not an excuse for why we have these cells that have 24 hours lights on, for why we have these cells with no view of anything, for why we have cells with no means of basic interaction of any kind. There's ways you could isolate someone without the mental torture aspect. I'll give an example. 25 years ago, the federal government did a study to determine whether images that remind parents of their kids or visits with their kids that are inmates, what impact that had. And what they found is it had a very negative impact, that it constantly reinforced the parents' failure and caused them to get depressed, anxiety, and other mental health issues that led to violence and custodial care control issues. So what do you think the federal government, Bureau of Prisons, did? They increased by tenfold the number of images they show of parents and children in federal prisons and jails, just to torture them. That's who runs our prison system. People that Stephen King's novel that became the book and movie is representative of who runs our jails and prisons. It is not an exception. It is the norm. It is exceptional when you have a decent style prison guard or warden. That's unfortunately, they're understaffed. They bring in the bottom level people. Usually they're people that are sociopaths more often than not. Again, not all. I know there are people out there that work in the Bureau of Prisons that are good people. Not saying every single person is bad. I'm saying the system is designed to draw in some of the worst, particularly those in positions of power within the system. And it's, this particular jail in Louisiana, where Owen Shroyer is located, had mishandled COVID so bad that a bunch of people died. So their procedure really was punishment for the prison inmates ever raising the complaint, by just routinely sticking them in torture, which is what solitary confinement is, for days upon their arrival. And it shows you how barbaric our prison system is in America.
In as much as I ever knew anything about it, Jeremy McKenzie, Diagolon guy from Canada, was in solitary for upwards of 2 weeks. Tamara Litch, the Coots Four, sporadically just thrown into solitary. Artur Pavlovsky, the pastor, thrown into solitary. And the explanation for COVID, which, makes absolutely no sense, period. But then it was just for behavioral issues, for punishment, and not to protect inmates from the most, like you say, the most violent of violent. But Robert, the question was going to be this. Oh, the amendments, sorry. Fourth Amendment, just so everybody does this, protection from unreasonable search and seizure. Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. Eighth Amendment,
and due process. And so Fifth Amendment sometimes applies in these contexts if the Eighth Amendment doesn't.
And then the eighth is the cruel and unusual punishment.
Correct. And all the state actors they're more and more creative at getting out of things. They're like, well, this isn't punishment yet, so now we can be cruel and unusual. I mean, this is some of the dumb logic some of our courts are accepting. And sadly, many of those are usually the conservative courts. They're always trying to find an excuse to cover up for corruption in police offices, prosecutorial offices, and the military. Those are the three institutions they're happy to cover for, as well as corruption within religious institutions. Happy to cover for them too. Our so-called originalists on the court, in the court system. And the Wisconsin inmate class action is a classic example of this.
The examples of it, people can easily and very, what's the word? Not cowardly, but rather just insensitively say, well, they're in prison. What do they expect?
The sort of callousness that dehumanizes people because they're inmates.
If you want good treatment, don't break the law. And then, to some extent, good treatment is different than being denied medical.
In reality, what they don't understand is that what you're really saying is not be good or you can suffer this. It's don't offend the powers that be or you won't suffer this. Because it's not you're often in prison for reasons that have nothing to do with actual criminal behavior, sadly.
So the Wisconsin, it's a class action complaint. I don't know if it's been authorized or what stage it's at, but it's inmates, each of which detailing all the representative plaintiffs talking about how rotten teeth, not getting treated, and then when they're getting treated, infections that are not getting treated. One inmate with diabetes that had been under control for 15 years, denied medical treatment, and has all sorts of issues. They're suing for all of the, Eighth Amendment violations.
Every method available: inadequate food, inadequate medical care. This is a Waupun institution in Wisconsin that's been on lockdown for almost a year. It's like, why? They still can't explain why. And I can tell you why. They have inadequate staff. And it's a lot cheaper if you just stick everybody on lockdown. It mentally tortures everyone, deprives them of social contact, deprives them of recreation, deprives them of physical activity. They're also giving them inadequate food. They're often stuck with 24-hour lights on, often with no window access to anything. And they know the mental, and many of these inmates are elderly. These aren't gangbangers in their 30s. This is some old guy caught on burglary charges in his 60s, right? From old sentencing regimes that had long sentences attached to crimes we no longer attach long sentences to. So you've got mostly a lot of elderly, most of the inmates that are suing are elderly. Elderly inmates not getting basic medical care, not getting basic food care, because the medical system is I've sued the Wisconsin system over and over again. It's a complete crock. They just don't fund it. It's the worst possible doctors, the worst possible medical care, you name it.
The plaintiff Kenneth Dahlberg, 62-year-old inmate who suffers from degenerative joint disease, artificial implants in both shoulders, diabetic, continued heart disease. After diagnosis of heart disease, plaintiff Dahlberg was required to have coronary angioplasty and stents. Plaintiff Dahlberg was prescribed. They don't say what he was in for, as if that might change anything. But these are the going.
Yeah, you have a bunch of old people with basic problems. We know that in almost all cases, outside of very select kind of crimes, that old inmates are extremely low risk of recidivism. That the compassionate release makes a lot more sense in many of these cases. Trump tried to expand the grounds of compassionate release in the federal system, recognizing that us spending lots of money locking up derelict old criminal defendants, if they're in there for like drugs, they're in there for what you could call street crimes of like burglary, things like that. If they're not in there for a severely violent crime or a particular kind of sex crime, their risk of recidivism is very low, and why they're still in there makes no sense. And then that they're being treated as worse than a dog would be treated says something very bad about our Eighth Amendment enforcement in America. And just more people on the right are waking up to it, as people like Owen Shroyer experience it. And they're like, what in the world is going on? Because they fancied that this only happened to the bad, mean, greedy, violent sickos. No, it often happens to the weakest and most vulnerable and most inconsequential inmates that really probably don't belong there in the first place, or at least not at this point in time in their lives. And so that's it's just being exposed on a bigger, broader scale to a new political audience that previously ignored it. But there's a reason why the Eighth Amendment existed. Our founding generation did experience this abuse of power. People who went through the Civil War did experience this abuse of power. But people who went through parts of World War I and World War II experienced this abuse of power. This is why this law exists. It exists because you cannot trust this power to be used correctly in the hands of the people it's given to.
Robert, first of all, people in the chat are saying, some are saying that my volume is low and others are saying it's just fine. So I don't know what would account for one person's computer having a different audio level, but I'm doing my best to get there. What is the situation? What percentage of prisons in the States are private? Does it make a difference, private versus public, in terms of the neglect, need to maximize profit? What is
Unfortunately, no. Private prisons have had some more violent prison guards. That's been the only pattern I've seen so far, that they're more ruthless in putting down any questions or concerns or complaints, etc. But otherwise, the core problem is being both safe and taking care of people adequately is an expensive proposition for the state to do. Mm-hmm. And that's why only people that are truly ongoing, imminent threats to the community, in my view, mostly should be there. I believe in retribution to a point. But the degree to which we use the prison system to do why tax people are in prison makes no sense to me. You can make them pay a bunch of fines and punish them financially. They're not an imminent threat to the community.
Well, it would seem house arrest might be a better. It's
what the rest of the world does. Well, America's there with Russia and Iran. It's three of the only countries in the world that have substantial imprisonment sentences on tax issues. That's not company to be in. In the company of. So I mean, it's preposterous. Almost nobody in Western Europe does this. It's not effective. It doesn't work. Doesn't deter anything. Hasn't changed the tax gap. All the prosecutions in the past 50 years, including every time they escalate tax prosecutions, there's no change in the tax gap. The gap between the amount of money they say should be collected and they do collect. Right? And if you understand the nature of it, you know that that's never going to have that impact. So it's a waste of money, these prosecutions and punishments, and it's counterproductive. I had a case where a doctor was put in prison, a doctor that provided discounted care to people that needed it. All they did was make medical care more expensive in their local community. That political hack of a judge, one of these Obama authoritarians, the left authoritarian judges, they love to lock up the white collar folks. That's their real favorite. If you're a hardcore street gangbanger but you got a sob story, they'll let you out easy. If you're an ordinary, everyday, upstanding citizen who made one mistake, or what the government decides to now call a mistake, and can get you railroaded, oh, by golly, you better go to prison for 5 years, even if it means depriving the community of a necessary medical service. I mean, they're all authoritarians. Doesn't matter whether they're left or right. 90% of judges are authoritarians. And it's even worse that they're more barbaric, the ones that run our jails and that run our prisons. And they're an embarrassment to a humane society.